there's a truism in sort of public discourse that history repeats itself. And there's sort of an equal truism in academia that history never repeats itself. And I sort of would like to hear your thoughts on that. Is theory difficult in history because of that uncertainty about repetition, or that discomfort with repetition?
Yeah, I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? I mean, if in science you can kind of recreate experiments in identical conditions, and in human behavior, I mean, even outside of history, within sort of sociology or psychology now, I think it's very, very difficult to ever recreate the precise conditions in which a theory might be retested. And so I think for me that immediately means that, it's like we were talking about earlier, it's impossible to use theories as definitive concrete proof of anything. I think that's why I think they're more useful for spotting potential patterns. I mean, the does history repeat itself question is interesting in that I one of the things I'm always trying to do, but often unsuccessfully, is trying to get like my work into newspapers and magazines. And what they really, really want is things like saying this thing that's happening now is like a thing that happened in the past. For them, in order for history to be relevant, they want something that has a contemporary hook. So I'm constantly looking for those. I wouldn't necessarily say it's repetitions. It's sort of echoes, isn't it? Little sort of similar things that played out in the past and that we might look at now to help give perspective on the present. So in that sense, I do that quite a lot. So I'm currently doing something on, there's been like recent debates about, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter, about what we should do with sitcoms from the 1970s. What should we do with old jokes, right? Which are now offensive. And there's a really interesting debate about do we censor them? Do we put a warning in? All that kind of stuff. So I'm currently writing an article for a history magazine about how the Victorians did that to 18th century humor. How they kind of censored and approached that kind of bawdy sexual bodily humor of the 18th century and kind of rounded off its edges. So I've been looking at how they edited a joke book from the 18th century and basically republished it in the 19th century, but took out 50 odd jokes that they considered bad, that they censored. So for me, I was thinking, okay, right, that's interesting. There is something repeating here. We have a sort of generational shift in taste or in cultural values that is playing out in all number of different ways, just like it did, does now and did in the 18th, 19th century. And humor is one of the spaces where people think about that. So in that sense, looking for those echoes, thinking about how, if we're sort of theorizing the way that humor works now, how that might apply to a previous era, I think it's useful. But I'm skeptical of anybody who says that there is this kind of, there are those theories, aren't there, that history is sort of moving in this sort of incredibly predictable pattern of these kind of waves and cycles and generations, and that, that in X number of years we'll have a war or something like that, and that it's possible to predict this centuries before because of all these cyclical forces, like these sort of rhythms. And it may be possible to see those kind of things. It feels to me a bit like staring into tea leaves and seeing patterns. Like I'm not convinced by it as a robust thing. So I think, there are things do repeat in some respects, but never perfectly.
Yeah, the idea about the jokes from the 1970s and things like that is really fascinating, because I've been thinking about this a lot as well, in terms of Black Lives Matter, with the statues, and this idea that we're no longer considering certain individuals to be worthy or appropriate to have monuments to, but just the idea of whether or not monuments are something that is, are monuments meant to be long lasting, which seems a really weird grammatical sentence for me. But this is something that, again, in the 1970s, we were having very, very similar debates about who should be memorialized and how they should be memorialized and things like that. So for me, the questions seem to repeat more than the answers. So it's not that we always act the same way, but that we are constantly faced with similar situations. And in that respect, as critical as I am and as concerned as I am about turning history into literature, because I don't think they're the same thing, I think in terms of learning from the past, that might be the best way of dealing with it. I'm never going to be in the exact same situation as Germanicus or as Thomas Carlyle or Napoleon was, but I may face similar questions, and I can sort of take advice from how they decided to approach it and kind of being able to see how it turned out for them, that they answered those types of questions in those sorts of ways. So that's how I've always approached history repeating itself, is the fact that that's the universal part, is we keep asking the same questions, and the specific part is how we choose to answer them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it also kind of works in the other direction as well, doesn't it? That we can sort of look at how we're dealing with the problem and then think about how that might inform our understanding of how people in the past dealt with the same problem. And again, you've got to be careful about this stuff. Again, they're not in the same circumstances as we are, so the translation issue goes both ways. But I do find that useful. I find that, if history is always a dialogue between the past and the present, between the world in which the historian lives and the past they're exploring, as we face new problems, I think it does shed new light on, or it does gives us perspective and allows us to think about. I bet that people will be able to write some really interesting new research on the history of historical pandemics, having lived through them.
Right.
I bet that it does give you, and it's the same reason why we need more Black historians, because their perspective helps to inform Black history, right? That their lived experience is different to the lived experience of a white historian, and will, or one would assume at least, produce different kinds of perspectives on the past. I think that's a really useful thing. And so I do find myself sort of almost sort of translating backwards, thinking, okay, I'm living through this thing now. How might that shape? Does that change the way I think about the way people might have experienced this in the past? And the media is interesting, right? So the media one would be, look at the way that the internet has completely destabilized the industry of journalism. Mm-hmm. But we could think about the same kind of thing happening in the 19th century, and how technologies there completely changed the face of what a newspaper was, put loads of people out of the job, created new jobs, totally transformed what public reading was. There are interesting parallels there, and I think it's sort of it's kind of like theory, isn't it? You can sort of take a thing that we see happening now and the explanations for it and test them and say, okay, does this make sense in the 1880s? Sometimes not, right? But it's a kind of interesting, it's that tool to think with again, right? That's the sort of thing
I was just going to say. Yeah, it's this. And I think you've given me a really interesting perspective on it, I think, that I maybe didn't have at the beginning of this conversation, is that I often feel the urge to make history, it's going to sound very self-deprecating as a historian, to make history more relevant, to make history more robust, or seem more valuable to society. And theory seems like a way of doing that. Like if you could predict something, then people would value history more. And I think translating it backwards actually for me is very interesting. This idea that we can take our theories and our experiences and ask different questions, as opposed to take our data and give different answers. And being able to go backwards is a unique privilege of being a historian, I think. I don't think most other disciplines get the privilege of taking all the conclusions and the theories and then trying to break them apart with the data in the same way. So that's fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I mean, again, I feel like I'm just sort of got to say, and here are all the caveats for this kind of stuff. But just for the avoidance of doubt, I mean, I would still say in all this stuff, I'm still looking for evidence ultimately, right? That's all of this stuff is just interesting ways to think about things, interesting ways to ask questions, like you said, to get perspectives. But ultimately, when I'm going to publish something or when I'm going to make a claim, I'm still looking for that thing I can cite, or that thing where I can say, okay, here is how I know this, not here is how I think this might be true, or here is how I think this is likely. That's something, as long as I've got some kind of robust evidence for that, I'm all right. I wouldn't want just to apply the way we think about things now and say, that's probably what people thought in the 1880s. I'd be looking for some evidence for that.